Por favor, les invito a volver a tomar asiento para la última sesión del día. Les agradezco por su atención. Ha sido muchísima información. Estamos todos cargados de nuevas ideas, de nuevas posibilidades. Es la hora de revisar una última, que son los nuevos estándares para certificación en adaptación al cambio climático. Un tema súper interesante. Les pido por favor que volvamos a tomar asiento. Good afternoon, everyone. Please, I ask you kindly to take a seat. We are going to start our last session of the day. We've been filled with new information and ideas today, and we're having one last and very important session about the new standards for adaptation to climate change certification. So I welcome to this panel Richard Ilife. He is the manager for MRV for Gold Standard. So Richard, please.
Thanks, Laura. Okay. Afternoon, everyone. This is the last session. Yep. Adaptation certification. It may not sound the most exciting subject for our last session, but I will do my best. Okay, introduction to what I'm going to talk about. Over the past 2 days, we've talked and heard a lot about mitigation, fighting climate change. And we haven't actually heard so much about adaptation. It kind of came up as a question, you know, it's a gap. What are we going to do about it? I think, to be fair to what we've seen in the past 2 days, adaptation has been there. But it's been framed mostly within nature-based solutions. But not every project is and can have a nature-based solution. And we do need to think about adaptation for other types of projects, so in industrial type projects as well. So what I will do with this presentation, I'll try and whiz through it pretty quickly, but essentially showcase the gold standard adaptation requirements. Really what they are is a logical approach to identifying and managing risk in projects as a result of climate change. We've designed it as a certification solution, but really I think there's a little bit more in it. It's relatively simple in its concepts, and as I mentioned, it's logical, and I really think there are some cross-cutting themes that could be valued for all investments in SCF. And just to reiterate as well, adaptation is part of SCF, but it's framed mostly within nature-based solutions, and we need to think about it for other projects as well. So first of all, we need to ask the question, why adaptation? So yeah, I think we'll all agree, climate risks, climate change, it's here and now. I think we've all had some conversations here, even about the weather in Ecuador. It's unseasonably cool. Likely reason is climate change. So we're all experiencing it. So some facts on the screen. So 2020 was among the 3 warmest years on record in Central America and the Caribbean, and the 2nd warmest year in South America ever. So an example of some extremes in the Southern Hemisphere. So lack of snow on upper slopes of mountains, bleaching in coral reef bleaching in Australia, and wildfires in Argentina. In the continent where I'm from the UK. So sometimes a picture speaks 1,000 words. UK and Europe, we've never really suffered from rain. It rains quite a lot where I'm from, but you've probably heard Europe is facing and is undergoing a fairly significant drought this year in 2022. And so this map at the bottom of the screen on the right hand side, so anything that you see in orange represents essentially a drought warning, and that's 50% of the continent. So at a continental scale, climate change is clearly visible. And so you can see what that same map looks like last year in 2021. So it's, the warmer countries, so Italy and Greece, where you might expect stress from lack of rainfall. So what all this says is climate change is here and the effects are with us. So that means that whatever mitigation efforts we take, we can expect climate change to influence it. And those effects are being felt today, and really they're not expected to go anywhere in the future. And indeed, they, in all likelihood, will probably get worse. So adaptation, a definition, I mean, it's relatively straightforward. So it's change in systems in response to stimuli, effects, or impacts. So that's the UNFCCC definition. Fundamentally, adaptation can be seen as a risk reduction strategy. And an important aspect of that is that efforts and costs will increase as those impacts themselves increase. And so climate change is, I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with this graph. It's the Keeling curve of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. CO2 is not going down, and that trajectory looks very much towards the north. So we can expect efforts and costs to increase in future. And there are some statistics that back this up. So in developing countries, the estimated annual adaptation costs are in the range today of around $70 billion, but they're projected to reach 300 billion by 2030. So that's a significant, it's 4 times the cost in just 10 years. And another revealing statistic as well is only 21% of international climate finance goes to adaptation and resilience. And obviously the lion's share goes to mitigation. All of this is to say that we frankly are behind on adaptation. So I've kind of framed to start the problem, and it's quite pessimistic, but actually adaptation can be viewed in a slightly different way as well, because if you get adaptation right, it can mitigate risks and deliver impact, which is something that SCF was set up to do. So just some statistics to kind of whet your appetite. In low and middle income countries, investing in resilient infrastructure yields $4 for every $1 invested. And some examples from the World Meteorological Organization. So things like forecasting services overall have a cost benefit ratio of 1 to 10. And the final statistic, investing in resilience. So for every 1 million invested in various countries of the world, creates 650 jobs in India, 200 in China, 160 in Brazil and Indonesia, and 120 in the Russian Federation. These are all recent statistics from credible multinational organizations. So it's clear there is the potential for real impact with that adaptation. So gold standards vision, we've seen this slide before, but I just want to take apart that phrase climate security, which is in our vision. So climate security, as we understand it, is mitigation and adaptation. And really, we have to be honest, it's only recently that we've really started to try and address that second component of climate security, which is adaptation. And the first kind of formal way that we've tried to do this is by the adaptation requirements that we've developed. And so we've developed this as a certification solution. So adaptation is great, gaining in kind of recognition, and we've certainly noticed in our background research there are an increasing number of requests for proposals from local and regional governments for projects that had adaptation components built in, and there is an increasing growth of funds that are adaptation focused. So we can certainly envisage that a certification solution that proves that adaptation has been done right would have value in that circumstance. But really, I think there's a second component as well, and it's about reliably delivering the impact from investments in an increasingly uncertain world. So short background to the folks who are involved in developing it. As I've mentioned previously, Gold Standard don't write our own rules. We kind of work with experts to do so. And we have partnered with Resilient Cities Catalyst. So they are a non-profit organization formed by members of the 100 Resilient Cities leadership team. We started this, the authoring process in 2021, in December. And once the first draft was produced, it was then endorsed by an independent technical advisory panel that Gold Standard assembled. And it included some highly respected organizations such as EBRD, CAF, CPI, and ICLE. So really wanted to make sure that these requirements were stress tested. So that's the initial approval process. And what we've started now is piloting these requirements to make sure that they are, kind of roadworthy, for want of a better phrase, that they're really doing what they expect in the real world. We have a couple of pilots underway. So it's one in Pittsburgh in the US, and also one in SNCF with Pegasus in the Galapagos 6 Senses investment opportunity that we've seen and heard about today. Just to be absolutely clear, it's very, very early stages in the 6 Sense project. So we don't really have any significant things to report on that, but we hope that will change in the future. The adaptation requirements. So COP27 is happening in Egypt this year. So, and I'm sure many of you know, it's being framed as the adaptation COP. So we have always had that in mind in terms of trying to get these requirements out. And as with anything within Gold Standard, any rules and requirements we have goes out for public consultation. So that's going to be happening in the next month or so. So we'd really appreciate you all to take a look at the requirements themselves and share your feedback. So all in all, this is part of a continuous learning process that we have. So some of the key concepts, these are, the key concepts are probably borrowed from the disaster risk reduction community, and this risk triangle is pretty well established in the literature. I've adapted it for the purposes here, so it's from Crichton and Co. Just so it's clear that it's their work, not mine. So risk, climate risk, that is the probability of negative impacts happening. So obviously that's the thing that you need to get a handle on when you are trying to adapt to it. And risk is a product of hazard probability, vulnerability, and exposure to that risk. And I'll just try and explain those concepts a little bit more. So hazard probability, so this is the potential occurrence of an event or trend that can cause negative impacts. From the climate perspective, these can be in the form of shocks or stresses. Shocks are high magnitude, low frequency, for example, a flash flood, and a stress is low magnitude, high frequency. So taking the water example, this would be lower rainfall, drought. Exposure, this is quite simple to understand. It's the level of contact with a hazard, event, or trend. Vulnerability, this is the tendency to be negatively affected by a hazard or trend, and it has two components that need to be assessed. So first of all, the sensitivity. So this is susceptibility of human beings, infrastructure, assets, and environment to be affected. And the second part is adaptive capacity. So adaptive capacity is the ability to access resources to be able to basically deal with and respond to impacts. So those two components are key when you want to be able to measure vulnerability. So just to illustrate these concepts in an example, so a flood is a type of climate shock. If we think about the hazard probability, we can say that in a given area, there is 10% of a flood occurring within the next 50 years. We think about exposure, there are 100 houses in a community within a river basin that is likely to flood. And vulnerability, trying to think about those houses, the way that risk expresses itself is slightly differently. So in terms of sensitivity, we could say that 90 of those 100 houses that are exposed are not flood proofed. So therefore they're more susceptible to flood. And if we think about those 100 households that are exposed, if we can say that 80 of those hundreds don't have insurance or qualify for government aid if their homes are damaged, these do not have resources to be able to adapt and deal with a flood. So hopefully those key concepts make sense, because they're essential to understanding the rest. Project cycle, I will zoom over this very quickly because I'm conscious of time. The key messages in here essentially are, there are 4 steps before you get to the point at which you implement a project. So the emphasis on adaptation is really a very careful design process. Right early on in the planning, there are certain there is a key concept that goes throughout, and that is that at each stage the cycle is aligned to allocate resources accordingly, because of the fact that risk can express itself slightly differently depending on the number of resources that you invest in terms of trying to understand it. So it kind of zooms in from a high level approach to really zoom in on granular risks. And a really important concept of the project cycle that I will talk about shortly is engaging stakeholders. So there is a combination of experts, but those experts consult constantly with people who are likely to be affected by and who can share input on a project that has adaptation in mind. So I'll talk about the steps in a little more detail. Hopefully the clicker will work. Yep. Okay, so the first step is project concept and planning. And there are 2 parts to this. So the first part on this slide is defining the brief. So really this is defining the basic project objectives, the boundaries, systems and resources on which that project depends, and also things that will be impacted by the project. And you can see why this is necessary, so you can understand the parameters that could be affected by climate risk. Early on in the project brief, the stakeholder reference group needs to be defined. And a stakeholder reference group is a very specific entity, and it's comprised of project stakeholders with representatives from key stakeholders. And so examples here would be people who are going to be affected by the project. So project beneficiaries, there would be businesses within an area, there would be government, there would be NGOs, perhaps. All of these people will have slightly different perspectives, and their views need to be represented. So therefore they need to form part of that stakeholder reference group. And then the really key thing that happens in the concept is a very early assessment of climate importance must happen. And this is essentially a rough and ready risk assessment of climate hazards to the project and the objectives that it has. And so if you can see that matrix on the x-axis, we have consequences of climate related failure, and that moves from low to high. On the y-axis, severity of climate hazards, moving from low to high. And essentially, if you think about consequences, low consequences would be something that has limited financial impact and certainly wouldn't cause human death or injury. If you consider high consequences of climate related issues, you'd be thinking about widespread impacts, expensive damages, and unfortunately death and injury. And and the severity is also on the y-axis. So if you can, you map how, depending on where you appear on the x-axis and on the y-axis, you can then obviously cross-reference, and in fact, I'm going to try and use the pointer, where you appear on this matrix. And so red, as you might expect, represents high climate importance. Green represents low climate importance. This assessment is really important, is really key to the rest of the steps in the project, because essentially, if there is a high climate importance, you need to put more expensive resources onto that project, because it needs a more quantitative, more rigorous assessment to the risks that are present. If it is low importance, somewhere here on the matrix, a more qualitative approach is advised. And so the outcomes of this feed into the team. Oops, yeah, that are formed, and so again, depending on whether there is high or low risk, the types of people who are involved and the processes in which they're involved in will differ. So I'm just going to talk super quickly about the project team. So a project team in an adaptation project needs to have three key members. So number one, a climate adaptation lead. Their role in the project is to identify natural hazards and do the risk assessment. The second member of the team is a climate science consultant. So they essentially provide climatic science input to the natural hazards that the climate adaptation lead identifies. These two should be specialists in their field, and that is either demonstrated with a degree in a relevant subject. So let's say in the case of adaptation, work on disaster risk reduction or urban planning. Climate science consultant, they would have a degree in climate science, perhaps engineering or environmental sciences. And if we can just think about the climate science consultant, they have a different role depending on the outcome of the early risk assessment that I showed on the matrix. So for low climate importance, they can be involved in reviewing the output of a natural risk assessment. But for things with high climate importance, the climate science consultant actually participates in data collection. They're not merely just involved in review of the natural hazards. The third and final component is a local development consultant. And essentially, this is the person who coordinates the stakeholder reference group. So that stakeholder reference group, as I mentioned, it must be representative of the key people who are going to be affected by the project. And the first thing that needs to happen once the project brief has been developed is science-based education needs to be given to the major stakeholder groups. So really it's capacity building about climate change, trends and potential impacts, so that they really actually understand what the potential impacts could be on the project. And this early, excuse me, education and consultation process, as you would expect, it's really to get early stakeholder perspectives concerning the project. Why do we advocate a deep engagement with stakeholders? I think really it's to balance risk of over-engineering solutions with not fully accounting for plausible future conditions. So you can imagine if you don't talk to stakeholders and hear what they're saying about the project, it can be very easy with a desk-based assessment to think, well, this area clearly has a climate risk. We need to build, massive concrete and shore up the slopes of an area. When actually, if you engage with stakeholders, you might find, based on what they've experienced in the area, that the risk isn't as bad as what you thought. Okay, so now we can dig in a little bit more to the mechanics of the project. So developing the project design. So moving from that early brief, this is when the climate hazards really start to be understood and systematically addressed. And the team, as mentioned, they can use any credible, recognized approach. So on screen, this is an approach that the Resilient Cities Catalyst have developed. any other approach from the UN or perhaps a development or local government, national government, any recognized approach can be used, but it's suffice it to say that it will follow relatively similar a similar setup, which is basically identifying the hazards and then going through and defining whether, first of all, they are a shock or a stress, as we mentioned earlier in the definitions, and then talking about what that hazard looks like, what the probability of that hazard occurring is, and moving through all of the different hazards. So unfortunately, you can't really see it too well, I'm pretty sure, but so things like changing temperature, changing precipitation, sea level rise, windstorms, hailstorms, hurricanes, these are the sort of climate hazards that would appear on here. And the main aim of this hazard analysis is to define the likelihood of these things occurring in a project. Once this hazard analysis has been done, it's then that the risk assessment needs to be done. And so if we're thinking about the risk triangle, we have exposure and vulnerability. So obviously those need to be populated in the framework. So if you can think of it as a simple spreadsheet in which the rows are populated with exposures, vulnerabilities, and recall we have sensitivity and adaptive capacity. All of those are defined for the climate hazards. Oops. An important point here as well is, well, first of all, with regard to adaptive capacity, disadvantaged population groups. So we can think about events, so Hurricane Katrina, certain groups in different socio-economic conditions are particularly disadvantaged to risk, and these really need to be kind of considered in this analysis. The other key component is trying to build in some of the known uncertainty about climate change, and these are called climate scenarios, and typically these are expressed as representative concentration pathways. So this is a concept defined by the IPCC, International Panel for Climate Change. And essentially these are best guesses on what the world might look like under certain conditions. So RCPs are actually expressed in watts per square meter rather than temperature, although obviously there is a correlation here. And so we have RCP, I think it's 4, 5, 6, and 8.5. Can't read it so well, but essentially you have 4 different severities of climate change depending on what might actually happen. And you need to be able to define the potential of what the project might look like for different hazards. And so this particular example on screen is sea level rise. So you can see here the first RCP, we have a sea level rise of 0.4. If we look at the more extreme, we're looking at 1 meter. So as you can see, there are different expected severities depending on what may eventually occur. And I think what is interesting about these representative concentration pathways, I think the baseline is around here. So this is what the world is currently projected to experience if we don't mitigate quick enough. So serious impacts, 0.8 meters rise in sea level. You need to be able to build that into the hazards that are relevant to your project. Once the vulnerabilities, exposures have all been defined, what then needs to happen is a risk rating needs to be ascribed to it. And there is again a kind of simple matrix that is used to basically integrate the likelihood of something happening against the consequences. So as you can see, something that is low likelihood to happen, potentially even it could be a catastrophic consequence, so widespread death, destruction, expense. You can see here that because of the fact it is improbable in its occurrence, it means it has a relatively low risk, a kind of medium level risk. Whereas if you consider something that happens frequently and is catastrophic, you can clearly see that receives the highest risk rating. All of this is fairly straightforward. It's just using models to structure thinking. And this risk assessment, obviously, it needs the benefit of that stakeholder reference group. And that happens in the next phase. So essentially, for all of the risks that have been scored in the earlier matrix assessment here, what then needs to happen in consultation with the stakeholder reference group is it needs to be agreed what risks are unacceptable, what risks are critical, what risks are manageable, and what risks are acceptable. And this is known as the ALARP framework, as low as reasonably possible. And this is done in consultation with the stakeholder reference group. And so for those things coming up with unacceptable and critical risks, essentially the project needs to do something different, really, because of the fact that level of risk simply is not something that can be managed with the project. If in consultation with that group, risks are manageable and acceptable, then what needs to happen is a series of targets or mitigation outcomes need to be defined for that project so that it can be clearly tracked and monitored over time. Essentially, Then once in the project, all of those manageable risks have been defined and the key indicators have been set. All of the requirements need to be specified for the project to achieve its aims under a shock condition. And so what the purpose of this is to essentially risk-proof that project against a total failure. So imagining an unexpected condition that really needs, the requirements should be specified to be able to deal with that pretty much unanticipated event. And the other aspect of finalizing the design, as I've mentioned, we have targets and indicators for risks, but a key component as well is the project needs to consider mechanisms for managing potential future conflicts. Again, it's trying to anticipate the unknown and put in place something to manage it. And another key aspect as well is in advance of the project being implemented, there needs to be trigger values input for specific targets and indicators. And those trigger values, essentially before the project even starts, they are something that are agreed with the stakeholder reference group, should trigger a change in the project and its management approach to basically evolve with the changing risk profile. That's pretty much it. So as you can see, it was a logical framework with an emphasis on careful planning and design, and really hopefully what comes across is that there is an integration of people with technical expertise, but also with local affected stakeholders is something that's very key to gold standard, and it was also brought forward very strongly by Resilient Cities Catalyst when they developed these requirements with us. I suppose other takeaways, I mean, hopefully I set the scene at the start. You know, we're behind on adaptation, and really it can be seen as more than just risk mitigation. You know, I think if you think of terms in risk mitigation, especially with in investments, it's almost like more reasons for people not to invest. If you can kind of frame it as a way of achieving impact and making sure that the sustainable outcomes are achieved, then it's kind of a little bit more palatable from an investment perspective. And yeah, with that in mind, what we hope to achieve with these requirements is, yeah, to be able to deliver impactful outcomes, everything that we've talking about over these 2 days, but be able to manage the fact that things are increasingly uncertain as a result of climate change. So yeah, I will pause there and happy to answer any questions.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It's a quick question on, hi, thanks. You said that one of the requirements of the framework you guys are developing is to identify climate hazards, if I understood correctly, right? And then we know that to do this assessment analysis can be really hard because we have a limitation in terms of tools, resources, and etc. Let's say to identify if a given region is subjected to a flooding hazard or high temperatures and this kind of stuff, right? My question is if you are the framework will also suggest tools and resources for projects to use in order to identify and report back climate hazards?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say in terms of tools,
¿Otra vez? Ahora sí.
I could use yours. Well, it's working. Yeah. Yeah. No, good question. It's all about making things a bit less complex. I would say we're early in the development. We're piloting. It's a very good suggestion. We're not there in terms of tools. I think the approach here really is to kind of specify the hazards. So you probably didn't see it so well on that spreadsheet, but it did lay out hazards in a. Well, certainly when I looked at it, I thought, okay, I really hadn't thought about those things. So there is a structure there that I think guides people and the reliance on experts. So that why the team is specified. I think that's the kind of the middle step on the way to tools. But yeah, no, it's a good point.
Perdón. No sé si me va a poder responder usted la pregunta. Sí, porque es nuevamente desde una mirada más política e integral. Si yo entiendo, y siguiendo la línea de lo que preguntó el anterior participante, lo que buscamos con esto es que las inversiones puedan tener prevenir los efectos que pudieran, o los riesgos que pudieran tener desde el punto de vista climático, ¿cierto? De manera tal que los afectados ojalá terminen en algún minuto siendo beneficiados, ¿cierto? Para eso es. Si eso es así, la metodología tiene que estar al servicio de lograr ese propósito y no solo asegurar la rentabilidad de la inversión privada. Entonces, si es así, mi reflexión va en la siguiente línea. Si la inversión que se va a hacer va a contribuir a la adaptación o a mitigar efectos del cambio climático, lo que uno esperaría, desde la mirada política, como autoridad política, que la tasa de interés o la amortización de esa inversión sea menor que aquella que no aporta a la adaptación o a la mitigación. Primera pregunta, ¿es así o no es así? ¿Se está pensando así o no? Segunda, si estamos tratando que los afectados terminen siendo beneficiados, ¿cierto? los compromisos con la comunidad debieran tener una ponderación en la evaluación positiva. Mientras más compromisos, más cambios positivos en la vida de las personas, mejor evaluado debería estar ese proyecto. Me gustaría saber si eso se está pensando así o no también. Tercero, como los territorios, el cambio climático afecta territorios amplios. Vuelvo a la pregunta de ayer. ¿Quién me garantiza la coherencia de esa inversión con la política pública de esa comuna, de esa región? Y ahí llego al cuarto punto. ¿Quién y cómo hace que los riesgos que pueden existir se enfrenten? Solo se va a poder enfrentar si hay una alineación previa de la inversión que se quiere hacer con los objetivos y las estrategias de la autoridad comunal, local y regional. Si no, se transforma en un ejercicio solo con la mirada privada. Eso.
So, Tania would like to complement the question.
Tal vez para complementar, porque tiene mucho que ver con la intervención que acaba de hacer. Al ver el framework, digamos, y los criterios, planteó solamente criterios de riesgos climáticos. Yo entiendo, bueno, por lo menos UICN, al hacer análisis de riesgos, tiene que tomar una serie como de aspectos. Si el proyecto va a afectar con reasentamientos involuntarios, esos son los estándares, ¿no? Reasentamiento involuntario, restricción de acceso a recursos, patrimonio cultural, el tema de poblaciones indígenas, o sea, son los 4 hasta derechos humanos. Incluye también los de biodiversidad y cambio climático, etcétera. O sea, son como varios criterios, ¿no? Entonces, mi pregunta, que también va un poquito en relación con lo que menciona, en las evaluaciones que hacen, ¿incluyen esos criterios? Por ejemplo, todo el tema de gobernanza, que tiene que ver con lo que acaba de mencionar. O sea, ¿qué tipo de gobernanza hay? Que gobernanza es un concepto amplio, pero muy aterrizado alrededor de una iniciativa. Eso es una pregunta. Y la otra es, ¿han tenido casos o análisis de casos de, por ejemplo, seguros de cosecha? Seguros como los hay, por ejemplo, en el Mesoamerican Reef, en el arrecife mesoamericano, seguros contra riesgos a desastre en zonas costeras, por ejemplo, que son seguros cuando ocurre un desastre o para cosechas. No sé si tal vez de ejemplos que puedan haber analizado, ¿no? Son las dos cosas. Gracias.
Okay. Thank you for all your questions. They're very good. So it's not just about investment return. So I think maybe to address all of your questions, it's a very complex topic, and I don't really think I've given it justice in however many slides that was, 16 slides or so. It's been necessarily simplified. So just to take your point on non-climate risks, it was actually in the presentation. I forgot to mention it. So it was kind of small text, so it was in there. So in terms of lowering interest rates, absolutely that would be a great outcome from it, and that's certainly how we would like to see this thing, basically to incentivize interest in these types of projects. So yeah, so it's not just about preserving investors, it's about also defining project objectives and making sure those objectives are achieved. So that, in terms of your questions about public policy and authorities, certainly within SCF, the whole aim of it is to do it in conjunction with subnational goals. So yes, we would hope that there would be some coherence, and that very much depends on how partners in the consortium engage, and also how active NDAs and other governments are with the SCF initiative. So for sure, yeah, point noted, and yeah, it's yeah.
Any more questions?
Oh, harvest insurance. No, that's the easiest to answer. No, we haven't looked at that. Okay, thank you.
¿Otra pregunta? No, aquí. Una.
Gracias. Thank you for the presentation. I'm from the Ministry of Environment of Uruguay. When we work in climate change and trying to engage private sector from the public sector in all these strategies and kind of goals, we know that engaging private sector in adaptation is a big challenge. So I was just wondering, who do you think, or who do you see would be your clients, basically, for this tool or certification?
Yep, so it's a good question. So the clients we would envisage for the full certification option would be the increasing requests for proposals from governments to have things like adaptation built in their projects. So and that's something that the Resilient Cities Catalyst have also told us, that it's an increasing kind of requirement for adaptation to be built into proposals for projects. So we think there's a space for that, and we think there's a value in certification there, and also in funds. So we're piloting it in SCF. I would say adaptation is not specifically referenced so clearly in SCF, but obviously it is a component. We have seen a number of adaptation and resilience funds being developed. If SCF and fund certification is successful, we think adaptation funds would also benefit from it as well. So.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? So if there are not any more questions, queremos agradecerles por toda la atención, por el esfuerzo, por la dedicación del día de hoy. Sabemos que ha sido una jornada muy potente, muy empaquetada de información, pero esperamos también que haya abierto, iluminados y encaminado algunos de sus proyectos hacia nuevas ideas, nuevas estrategias, nuevos conceptos, soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, agricultura climáticamente inteligente, acuacultura climáticamente inteligente, nuevas formas de gestionar residuos, la necesidad que tenemos de ver temas como residuos, como agua, como energía, y la necesidad que tenemos también de trabajar no solamente en la mitigación del cambio climático, pero también en la adaptación, porque es una oportunidad para entregar impactos que sean oportunos y que tengan, bueno, valga la redundancia, gran impacto. Queremos invitarles nuevamente el día de mañana. La jornada es más corta, pero igualmente interesante. Vamos a hablar con las entidades financieras acerca de oportunidades para complementar proyectos, iniciativas como el Subnational Climate Fund. ¿Qué pueden hacer desde la banca regional? ¿Qué pueden hacer desde los bancos privados para apoyar a estos proyectos que esperan tener alto impacto y la construcción de infraestructura resiliente al cambio climático? Vamos a abrir las inscripciones otra vez a las 8:30 de la mañana. Los esperamos para comenzar a las 9 de la mañana. Y nuevamente, gracias por el esfuerzo el día de hoy y esperamos que les haya sido provechoso. Que tengan un buen descanso esta noche.